February 27, 1991, 2 p.m. Washington time. President George H.W. Bush is in the Oval Office with his top advisors, Defense Secretary Dick Cheney, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Colin Powell, National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft. They're watching CNN footage of the Highway of Death, the destroyed Iraqi convoy fleeing Kuwait. Powell speaks first. "Mr. President, we've achieved all our objectives. Kuwait is liberated. The Iraqi army is shattered. If we continue attacking, it's going to look like slaughter." Bush nods slowly. "How long until we can end this?" Powell checks his notes. "We can call a ceasefire at 8 a.m. tomorrow, February 28th. That would make it exactly 100 hours of ground combat." Bush makes the decision. "Let's do it." Welcome back to Gulf War Chronicles. Today we're talking about one of the most debated decisions of Desert Storm, why President Bush ended the war when he did. The ground war had been going for just under 4 days. Coalition forces were demolishing Iraqi resistance. The Republican Guard was being destroyed. Some commanders wanted to push all the way to Baghdad, but at exactly 100 hours after the ground offensive began, Bush called a ceasefire. For the next 3 decades, people have argued whether that was the right decision. Let's examine what actually happened in those final 6 hours. By the morning of February 27th, the military situation was clear. Kuwait was liberated. Iraqi forces were in full retreat. The Republican Guard units that had stayed to fight, the Tawakalna, the Medina, had been shattered at battles like 73 Easting and Medina Ridge. Iraqi casualties were in the tens of thousands. Coalition casualties were minimal. By any measure, the war was won. The question was, how much further should coalition forces go? General Norman Schwarzkopf and his field commanders were pushing north and east, pursuing retreating Iraqi forces. The 24th Infantry Division was racing toward Basra, trying to cut off Iraqi escape routes. The 3rd Armored Division was still engaged with Republican Guard remnants. The 1st Marine Division was securing Kuwait City. Everything was moving fast, maybe too fast. Units were spread out, logistics were stretched, and the battlefield was becoming chaotic. At 0800 hours on the 27th, Bush convened a meeting of his war cabinet via secure video conference with Schwarzkopf in Saudi Arabia. Schwarzkopf reported that coalition objectives had been achieved. Kuwait was free. Iraqi military power was broken. The Republican Guard had lost most of its combat effectiveness. Schwarzkopf estimated Iraq had lost over 3,000 tanks, over 2,000 armored vehicles, and suffered over 25,000 casualties. The Iraqi military was no longer a threat to its neighbors. But Schwarzkopf also said his forces could continue the attack. The gate was closing on Iraqi forces trying to escape through Basra, but it wasn't fully closed. Thousands of Iraqi troops and hundreds of vehicles were still getting out. If coalition forces continued attacking for another 24 to 48 hours, they could destroy even more of Iraq's military capability. Some of his commanders were frustrated about stopping when they had the enemy on the run. Colin Powell had a different perspective. He argued that continuing the attack would achieve diminishing returns. Yes, they could kill more Iraqi soldiers and destroy more equipment, but at what cost to coalition political unity? Arab coalition members were already uncomfortable with the extent of Iraqi casualties. Continuing to attack retreating, defeated forces would look like a massacre. The images from Highway of Death were already causing international concern. How much worse would it get? There were also practical considerations. The coalition's UN mandate was to liberate Kuwait, not to occupy Iraq or overthrow Saddam Hussein. If coalition forces pushed to Baghdad, something some voices in Washington were calling for, they'd be exceeding their mandate. That could fracture the coalition. Arab states like Saudi Arabia and Egypt had joined to liberate Kuwait, not to destroy Iraq as a state. Pushing beyond the UN mandate risked losing their support. The ceasefire timing was almost poetic. 100 hours of ground combat, 4 days. Bush and his advisors liked the symbolism. It suggested precision, a planned operation executed perfectly and concluded at exactly the right moment. It would play well domestically. Americans love a decisive, clean victory. The 100-hour war, it had a ring to it. But in those final 6 hours before the ceasefire, the fighting didn't stop. Coalition forces were still advancing, still engaging Iraqi units that were trying to retreat or regroup. The Battle of Rumaila oil field happened in those final hours. Elements of the Hammurabi Division of the Republican Guard tried to make a stand and were destroyed by the 1st Infantry Division. American soldiers were still dying in those last hours, including some in friendly fire incidents. At Rumaila, Lieutenant Colonel Pat Ritter's task force encountered Iraqi T-72s and BMPs trying to escape north. His M1 Abrams tanks engaged and destroyed over 50 Iraqi vehicles in less than an hour. The Iraqis fought back but were overwhelmed. It was another one-sided engagement that showed just how outmatched Iraqi forces were. But it also raised the question, if coalition forces were still destroying Iraqi units this easily, why stop? There was also the issue of Saddam Hussein himself. He was still in power in Baghdad. The Bush administration had hoped, maybe even expected, that Saddam would be overthrown by his own military or people after such a catastrophic defeat. That didn't happen. When the ceasefire went into effect, Saddam was still Iraq's leader. Some critics argued this was a mistake, that the war should have continued until Saddam was removed. But that had never been a coalition objective. At 0500 hours on February 28th, coalition forces received the ceasefire order. Effective 0800 hours local time, exactly 100 hours after the ground war began, all offensive operations would cease. Units that were in contact with the enemy would disengage. No further attacks unless fired upon. The war was over. In some locations, American and Iraqi forces were so close together that the ceasefire happened while they could see each other. Tanks stopped shooting mid-battle. Soldiers on both sides just stopped. The immediate aftermath was strange. Iraqi forces that had been fighting or fleeing suddenly just stopped. Some waved white flags. Some started walking back toward Iraq. Some stayed in their positions, not sure what to do. Coalition forces maintained defensive postures but stopped advancing. After days of constant movement and combat, everything just froze. But the ceasefire wasn't total peace. Iraq had to accept terms, withdraw all forces from Kuwait, release all prisoners, provide information about mines and booby traps, accept liability for damages. Schwarzkopf met with Iraqi military commanders on March 3 at Safwan airfield in Iraq to formalize the terms. The meeting was tense but brief. Iraq accepted all conditions. The formal end of hostilities was now official. The debate about the 100-hour decision started immediately and continues today. Critics argue that Bush should have continued the attack, destroyed more of Iraq's military, possibly pushed to Baghdad, removed Saddam from power. They point to the fact that Saddam remained in control, rebuilt his military to some extent, and remained a problem for another 12 years until the 2003 invasion. Supporters of Bush's decision argue he did exactly what the UN mandate authorized: liberate Kuwait and neutralize Iraq's threat to its neighbors. Mission accomplished. Going beyond that would have meant occupying Iraq, which would have required hundreds of thousands of troops for years, fractured the coalition, and potentially created a quagmire. Bush himself later said he made the right call, that occupying Iraq would have been a disaster. There's also the counterfactual question: what would have happened if coalition forces had pushed to Baghdad? Some military analysts think it would have been easy militarily. The Iraqi military was shattered. The road to Baghdad was open. Coalition forces could have been there in a week. But then what? Occupy a hostile country of 20 million people, deal with sectarian conflicts, rebuild a broken state. The 2003 Iraq War showed how difficult that would be. The Gulf War veterans I've talked to have mixed feelings. Some felt frustrated stopping when they had Iraq on the ropes. Others were relieved to stop the killing. Most understood that the decision was above their pay grade. Politicians decide when wars end. Soldiers just execute the orders. The 100-hour ceasefire was a political decision based on military realities and strategic considerations. One thing is certain, the timing created an iconic piece of war history, the 100-hour war. It sounds planned, precise, almost surgical. The reality was messier. The ceasefire happened when it did for multiple reasons: military objectives achieved, political concerns about continuing to attack defeated forces, coalition unity considerations, and yes, the symbolic appeal of 100 hours. All of those factors came together on February 27th to produce the decision. In those final 6 hours, coalition forces destroyed hundreds more Iraqi vehicles, killed or captured thousands more Iraqi soldiers, and secured the last portions of Kuwait. The Republican Guard units that escaped through Basra would later be used by Saddam to suppress uprisings in southern Iraq. Some historians argue that if coalition forces had closed the escape route completely, those uprisings might have succeeded. But that's speculation. What we know is this: at 8 a.m. on February 28, 1991, the shooting stopped. Kuwait was free. Iraq's military was shattered. Coalition casualties were low. By the narrow military objectives, the war was a complete success. Whether ending it when Bush did was strategically wise in the long term, that debate continues. If you served during those final hours of Desert Storm, or if you remember watching the ceasefire announcement on television, leave a comment below. The 100-hour decision defined how we remember Desert Storm, a quick, decisive victory. Whether it should have lasted 101 hours or 96 or 120, that's a question each person has to answer for themselves. Thanks for watching Gulf War Chronicles. The decision to end Desert Storm at 100 hours was one of the most consequential presidential decisions of the 1990s. It shaped the Middle East for the next 3 decades. Understanding why Bush made that